Hey everyone, this is Motzie. What you'll be hearing are the last two recaps for the Hainai official recaps before we jump into our next episode, our 2024 Pride episode, which drops in the last weekend of June. We hope you've been enjoying these recaps. We've really enjoyed making them. We've got part 2 dropping today, and part 3, the last of the recaps, dropping on Wednesday. Thank you so much for your support and patience, and please enjoy the rest of Act 3.
In episode 32, Alala, or Alala, memory, or worry, we enter on a phone call between DJ in the dark and one of the survivors from the Halloween incident. The survivor talks about the impossible deaths of some of the people at the party, one of them with their skull broken from a fall, not at all consistent with the gas leak story being spread by the media. DJ was absent for a while following their near death, but returned to spread the truth about supernatural incidents in Toronto. They talk about their experience in the recording studio, how they were a skeptic believer until the incident made them believe fully. They then talk about getting calls about the dollhouse incident, where people died, and 2 separate callers reference Mary, who DJ themselves reference saving them. In the next scene, other Mary begins to tell a story about a woman like the sun, who was nearly killed by a rotting thing in a stairwell, but is cut off when it distresses the person she's talking to. She then tells a story of a tall woman with a loving family who wanted to move to the city, make clothes, trawl vintage stores, returning to the moment she was attacked by the rotting thing, which upsets the listener once again. She changes tact, talks about a boy with stars in his eyes, whose parents told him he was special, and who attended to different beliefs, eventually earning the ire of extremist adherents of Hindutva, and being killed. He spent his years lying about being special as a business model, creating a persona to hide his kind and loving nature, obfuscating his real self. He eventually finds someone to love, and his lover turns out to be a much bigger liar than he. The next story centers an obedient boy who was the perfect, handsome, high-achieving son, who did everything his parents asked. Eventually, he reveals to his parents that he's gay, believing they owed him the freedom after everything he did for them. But they disagree, and he runs away to the city, unable to rely on anyone for a long time, until one day, he finds someone, or someone finds him, and he finally had someone to owe again. The last story is about a boy who is in love, whose love finds something, and drags him to a ramshackle house, and he loses his love in endless hallways. When he finds him, his love wants to love him back, but in a corrupt, horrifying, supernatural manifestation of his feelings, wanting to knit them back together, skin to skin and heart to heart. He's eventually rescued by a faceless, nameless man, though this boy remembers this man's face and name, even if nobody else does. Other Mary says she knows these stories because dreams can osmose through time and memory, especially between people who are connected. Her last story is about an infant who died. That is, her last story is about a young girl surrounded by death. She sees death everywhere after her father dies, a family friend, a cousin's classmate, a friend's father. She then describes deaths that occurred during the Duterte era. So many deaths. She was moved to act. The girl, the woman, tries to act, and her mother is furious. The girl believes it was her fault or so the story goes. Other Mary bids the listeners goodbye, and it's revealed to have been Laura, asleep, now needing to wake up. In the final scene, Evelyn calls Donner, having researched everything Elaine donated to the library, and says she knows where Elaine hid the journalist's Book of Elders. In episode 33, Libingan, or Burial Place, Evelyn, Ashvin, and Donner discuss how Elaine was buried with the Book of Elders, and how they can locate it, with Ashvin ensuring it isn't magically booby-trapped. When Evelyn suggests asking Mary, Ashvin and Donner refuse, both worried about her and her encounter with the serial killer Michael. When Evelyn asks about Murphy, they're both once again evasive, though it's clear he's out of town for some reason. Finally, Donner distributes protective charms from CJ, who created them as a favor to Laura. The next scene is a DJ in the Dark interview with a woman named Rosario. Rosario talks about playing in the Toronto necropolis as a child, while her mother visited a grave often. She loved exploring, and once even found an ancient crypt almost swallowed by the hill, which she dubbed the William Crypt. Young Rosario tries to open the William Crypt's door many times, but is unable to. This is where she encounters Pocket, a black cat with yellow eyes, whose name she simply knows is Pocket. Pocket seems to dislike her attempts at opening the crypt, but is otherwise affectionate towards her. In her attempts to open the crypt, she also meets a young white boy with light brown hair and ice blue eyes, who appears to be mute. When he tries to stop her from entering the crypt, she gets irrationally angry, shoving him and hurting him, which snaps her out of her strange episode as she helps him, distracting her from opening the crypt. Another time, after opening the gate but finding the crypt empty, she meets a young black boy in old-fashioned clothes. This one spoke and laughed, and he and Rosario spent time together. Only after she goes home does she notice that the boy seemed to cycle his lines, almost like a video game character. Later in the year, when she returns to the crypt at night, she finds it open, and where there was once a concrete wall, there was now a tunnel. As she explores it, she runs into a horrific, fleshy, amalgamated monster, running for her life before she runs into a man in the pitch black. She thinks she's safe, until she realizes she feels 3 hands on her, not 2, and a huge open wound near her face, a headless man with a floating red hand, trying to entrap her. When she escapes the men, she runs back to the amalgam monster, but realizes it's trying to protect her, and on her way out she picks up Pocket, the cat, who she somehow knows saved her life. Outside, Pocket reveals to her multiple forms: the horrible fleshy amalgam monster, then the 2 boys she met, then Pocket herself. Whatever the creature is, it tells her not to come back, but Pocket gently sees her off at the entrance of the cemetery. She keeps her promise, though she sometimes has nightmares about the place, and Pocket's yellow eyes, as though to remind her why she should keep away. At the end of the story, she briefly mentions telling her cousin about it, and reveals her last name is Donner Orosa, Detective Donner's cousin. In the final scene, Donner receives a call. Dooley's been attacked by an elder, his apartment set on fire. Donner rushes to help him. In episode 34, Aklatan, or Library, Part 1, Donner changes plans on a call with Laura and asks her to pick Dooley up and bring him to safety, to Siege's apartment, as she and Laura are currently dating. Donner's rushing to the Toronto necropolis, which confuses Laura, knowing they were meant to meet up at Elaine O'Donnell's grave at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. Donner reveals why he's going, the scene cutting to a recording of when he found Dooley shaken but unharmed after the attack. Dooley reveals that his elder attacker was held off by a protection spell, but that he was seeking Jay's pocket watch. Dooley knows it's somewhere in the necropolis, but he can't find it. Donner, however, suspects it's at the William Crypt, based on his cousin Rosario's story, a crypt that Dooley has never seen despite his thorough investigations. The next call is between Ashvin and Donner. Ashvin and Evelyn are already at Elaine's grave, but decide to head out and try another day. However, they soon realize they're trapped in a miasma after being turned around by supernatural means, and must find a way out by finding the source. They find that the grave is transformed into a stairway down, and they enter it. The next scene is a recorded monologue from the elder Clifford Bolden, a tycoon of printing and newspress, who's being interviewed by a man named Callahan, James Callahan, the false name used by the journalist Jay. Bolden bound books with echoes of fear death retold, recorded in the foci that successfully killed people. His books could recycle the magic and power from these retellings of fear deaths without killing anyone new, though it was much less potent. Despite this, Bolden formed an entire library of recounted fear deaths, altogether very powerful indeed. In the next scene, Laura leads Dooley into CJ's apartment while on a call with Donner. Dooley immediately recognizes CJ as the woman from Jay's papa's funeral. CJ demands to know which elder went after Dooley, and from his description, she surmises that it's Richard Henry, the benefactor's right-hand man. She had once placed a protection spell on Dooley on Jay's request, but Richard Henry was far more powerful than she, and should have broken it easily. Laura asks Donner if he heard the conversation, but his call is full of interference, which makes Laura think he's in danger. On a second phone, inspired by Mary, Laura rings Ashvin and gets the same result, though she hears him mention a miasma over the interference. Laura hurries off, asking CJ to help take care of Dooley, promising she's not going in alone. Meanwhile, Ashvin and Evelyn find themselves in a gigantic library. Evelyn opens a book and begins to drown, until Ashvin burns the book to ash and saves her. Ashvin then begins to burn the entire library down. In the next scene, Evelyn's alone and in a completely different part of the library. She encounters someone. Elaine O'Donnell, or a manifestation of her. She reveals the miasma is hers, which she made in order to trap Clifford Bolden forever, since they could not find a way to kill him. When Evelyn asks how she and Ashvin can get out, Elaine doesn't answer. In the final scene, Murphy returns from his trip out of town and receives an urgent call from Laura, who tells her both Donner and Ashvin are in magical trouble. Murphy seems set to run to Donner's aid, but when Laura's own call is cut off with interference, Murphy must make a choice as to who to save. In episode 34.1, Cueva, or Cave, Mary records notes to assist Evelyn in going through materials regarding Elaine O'Donnell. This takes place in early October, before the events of Undas on Halloween night. Mary feels sense memories of elders in some papers and realizes their stories, all with the initials CB, or Clifford Bolden. After blessing herself, Mary reads the stories out loud for Evelyn's records. Each story is told in the first person, the writer being the journalist, or Jay, himself, collecting stories from Clifford Bolden's library of fear deaths. The first story takes place in the 1970s, regarding Sylvia Lewin, an avid caver, a case Jay remembers from a news article where 5 cavers disappeared within a cave system north of Toronto, and 6 corpses were found. The 5 were Sylvia, her husband Harold, Harold's less experienced friends, Joseph and Gerald, and Sylvia's friend and experienced speleologist colleague, Arturo. They enter the cave system and find a central cavern strangely lifeless, with time seemingly stuck in place, and the sun never moving from when it shines in above. Sylvia and Arturo find the same cave after some exploration, but this one teeming with plants and microorganisms, and most notably, a headless body hanging from the stalactites. Arturo wants to leave and report to the game warden, but Sylvia wants to go back to the others, and upon her return, they find Harold injured, supposedly from sudden tremors that shook the cavern. When Sylvia helps Harold walk, he reveals it wasn't the earthquake at all. When they explore the dark tunnel, someone stabbed Harold in the leg during the tremors. They both pretend all is well, trying to get out of the caves, when they arrive back at the same cavern. Though the terror grips them, Arturo's calming nature keeps things from blowing up, as they decide to have Sylvia climb the hole in the very top of the cavern, where noonday sunlight, confusingly, continues to shine exactly the same. even after nearly a day within. When she emerges, it's deep into the night. From their vehicles, she reports injuries and getting stuck in the cavern, but returns with equipment to try and get everyone out through the hole. The cavern she enters is dark and normal, and she's terrified when she sees a gigantic elephantine wolf growling at her from above where she just entered. She runs into the tunnels where the others are, in the lifeless cavern, when she sees Arturo's throat slit, with Joe trying to stem the bleeding, and Gerald struggling with Harold as he tries to kill them with his knife, a gift Sylvia had once given him. On pure instinct, Sylvia rushes in to save them, the memory wiped clean of her mind, of her murdering her own husband with a pickaxe, but the evidence remaining as Gerald helps her get patched up. The remaining survivors, Arturo, still alive but bleeding out slowly, follow Sylvia out to where they could exit the cave. In the reading, Jay then switches to a report which details how every one of their corpses was found. The headless corpse hanging from the stalactites, Arturo and Joe confusingly close to the entrance, Harold in the cavern seemingly dead of a heart attack but covered in blood, Gerald in the narrowest tunnel having died from panic and blood loss, and Sylvia herself at the end of that tunnel, curled up like she was only sleeping. Bolden would eventually explain to Jay the rest. The elder was there to hunt the Wahila, and the Wahila ate his head. His body still tried to move, powered by magic, but ended up tangled in the stalactites in the cavern, a focus still in its pocket, that caused the miasma that trapped the cavers. Every single person in that cave died, afraid, when the miasma would not release them, except Sylvia, who had always been comfortable with the underground. Her only fear was that she could not save her husband and friends, and she died curled up in the little cavern with Gerald's body blocking the tunnel. In episode 34.2, Kapitbahay, or Neighbor, Mary contemplates the journalist and his relationship with the elder Bolden, how he seemed to be handling him, manipulating him on some level. She then shares two stories written in tandem, one event from two perspectives. Jay's notes detail how gleeful Bolden seemed about his death, and though the person who died was not a good person, he was a teenager, and it was nonetheless a tragedy. The scene then switches to Jay interviewing Brenna, the victim's classmate, who shared one half of the story but survived the incident. She mentions how the victim, Chris Parker, was a horrible bully, and how she was largely invisible at school, living in poverty and doing odd jobs, until she was hired by a rich man, Mr. Reelman, to watch his house some nights. He paid very well for what seemed to be a simple house-sitting job, though he would leave strangely detailed instructions that Brenna was expected to follow to the letter. Brenna does the job well, receiving praise from Mr. Reelman, and she earns a lot of money. When she begins to go to school in better clothes, Chris Parker pressures her into giving him an in, and she recommends him to Mr. Reelman for the job. She worries it'll lose her position, but Mr. Reelman asks her to watch the same house, and she does. She notices someone in the next house over, in a fairly empty area with only 4 houses across from each other, but she still does her usual routine. When she checks on the neighbors, she sees Chris Parker in the upper window looking terrified, knocking on the glass like he's crying for help. She at first thinks it's a prank, but sees something big walking in the hallway downstairs, and she calls 911 for help. When it doesn't go through, she tries to call Mr. Reelman. She only gets a recording, but it tells her to continue doing exactly as she's told, and wait for him to return. She decides to call the other house, and what she thinks might be the stranger answers the phone. She lies that the police are coming. She almost leaves the house, against Mr. Reelman's rules, but she's too afraid. When she goes back to the window, she sees Chris in the living room, sitting there, watching TV. She feels stupid for being pranked, until Mr. Reelman returns, and she sees an ambulance carting a body out as she walks by. He says Chris Parker didn't work out, and he's smiling as he says it. In episode 34.3, Kaibigan, or Friend, Mary digs up Jay's notes about Bolden, who seemed to have lofty ambitions about minimizing harm by recycling fear death from used foci. While he seems to mean well, Jay doesn't trust him, though Bolden seems to trust and like him, considering him a friend, asking Jay to call him Cliff. Jay then explains Chris Parker's side of the story in Kapitbahay, talking about how the teenage boy thought the world owed him, and how he was a bully, how he felt stifled by his perfect parents, who always expected perfection from him. He takes Mr. Reelman's job, but ignores his weird instructions, from shouting into certain rooms and not leaving the house at any time before Reelman's return. When he goes to see who's in the next house, he runs into a pretty girl with blue eyes and freckles, and she talks about being asked to watch Reelman's place a few years ago. After he returns to the house, thinking the girl was somewhat familiar, he hears someone enter the kitchen, where he might have forgotten to lock the door behind him. He runs to the bedroom to try and get the window open and escape, but he can't. He sees the same girl in the opposite bedroom window, and he realizes where he recognizes her from. An older girl he met at a baseball game, a player's girlfriend who later showed up in missing posters across town. Chris rushes to get an old gun he saw in Mr. Reelman's drawer, and shoots the gigantic intruder dead, going downstairs and answering the phone in a daze, saying nothing to Brenna on the other end. He believes he's safe, and a hero besides, when the basement door creaks open. In supplementary notes, Jay mentions this wasn't the first teen Reelman killed in a trap. The previous girl, Tabitha, was killed years prior. When Jay asks about Reelman, Bolden reveals that the benefactor killed him. A recording of another interview between Jay and Bolden reveals Bolden's findings about the foci and fear deaths that he recorded in his books, bound with human flesh. He talks about the impossibility of housing so much power in a single vessel, but that it has happened before, once with Savard, burning down an entire city block and killing hundreds, and once with the benefactor. Bolden finds out from Jay that he met Hyde's single survivor, Elaine, who was there the night of its fall, and seems intrigued by what memory she might hold of so many deaths, though he insists he would never do anything to cross the benefactor's invisible line. The final scene has Mary discover a note from Jay, reading, "He took Elaine." In episode 35, Tauhan, or Characters, Clifford Bolden wonders on an old recording about the power the benefactor possesses, and whether Richard Henry vies for that power. In it, he reveals that he sees people in his books as more like characters rather than human beings. The next scene takes place after the events of Halloween. Mary finally tells Nana about what happened that night, about the selfish Lori doll, who had natural magic power and used it selfishly. She also talks about her recent encounter with the serial killer, Michael. The next recording is Mary continuing her note-taking for Evelyn, over a month after the last recording she sent her. She details an important letter from Jay written in invisible ink, that it's possible even Elaine didn't know about. Jay notes that no elder can read these letters, and that he hopes that it's passed to his loved ones, Elaine and Franny, his nickname for Dooley. He says it's his fault what happened to Elaine, and how Clifford Bolden found her. He says he recorded as many stories as he could from Bolden's library of fear death, protected by Bolden himself as his friend. He talks about how elders can be killed if one destroys both heart and brain, unless they use a spell of partition, created by the benefactor himself. The spell of partition allows the caster to slice their soul into pieces and place them into soul-bound foci, so that, if they are killed in their body, they can still revive elsewhere. However, if one divides their soul too many times, little of their identity is left. George Langford, or George May, only divided himself into 3, retaining his consciousness, but his fellows divided themselves into many, and were barely sentient by the time they revived, or manifested from their foci. The spell of partition also trapped souls in the living world. The parts of the soul would remain in an endless purgatory of their own making, suffering forever until all parts of their soul are released. The next portion of Jay's notes has him apologizing to CJ for keeping the secret. He found Marianne Weeks's notes about her final plans, and how she passed away. She was able to alter the spell of partition so that she would retain all her consciousness in every piece of the soul, no matter how many, and every time that piece was used up, it would pass on to the next life, instead of being trapped. She split her soul over 100 times, dividing them into good foci she created. But because she chose not to share this with anyone else, she still could not match the number of foci from the entire Ordo. The reason she was able to do all this was that she did it as an act of self-sacrifice for the sake of others, rather than herself. She did this after her beloved brother, John Isaac Weeks, or Jack Robin, was killed by a focus, and she understood the emptiness of their original justifications around the foci, that the deaths they caused were fair and random, that there was no greater purpose to their work. Finally, Jay explains how he confronted and defeated Bolden. He'd kidnapped Elaine O'Donnell to extract the memory of Hyde's fall, and the hundreds of deaths therein. He feared the benefactor so much that he wished to gather power that might rival his, combining his library with the very event that made the benefactor so godlike. On his way to rescue her, Jay runs into Peter, a young man who often tagged along on his adventures, who admired him greatly. Jay gets rid of him to protect him. In an old recording, Jay confronts Bolden at his home during his ritual. When Bolden realizes Jay has a magical tool, he feels betrayed, thinking Jay works for the benefactor. Jay is almost killed, but Bolden is shot in the head by Dooley, who came after Peter told him what Jay was doing. Back in Jay's notes, he explains how they try to destroy Bolden's heart and brain, but he still somehow regenerates, so they try to find his soul-bound focus, unable to locate it, on him or in his things. Jay realizes that Bolden was like a dead man's switch, and his death might release all the horrors from his books into the world. So they instead decide to trap him, with Jay planning to partition his own soul the way Marianne did, to keep Bolden and his library trapped forever.
You're listening to Hainai by Motzie Dapul.